This is all very, very touching.
You mean you don't admire peace?
It's not really easy to like something you know nothing about.
For decades, Clint Eastwood was the definition of tough. He was the cowboy who never flinched, the cop who never blinked, and the man who built a legacy on silence and control. But behind that steely stare was a storm few ever saw. Now, at 39, his son Scott Eastwood has finally broken the silence, revealing the emotional truth fans have long suspected, but Clint never dared to admit. What Scott just confessed changes everything we thought we knew about the Hollywood icon. Clint Eastwood was never just a movie star. He became an American myth. The squinting gunslinger in The Good, The Bad, and the Ugly, the iron-fisted enforcer in Dirty Harry, and the grizzled anti-hero in Unforgiven. He carved a career out of silence, control, and danger. But as the decades rolled on, people began to wonder if that cool detachment was not just a role. Behind the scenes, Clint Eastwood's personal life was nothing short of a mystery, and not the glamorous kind. For years, whispers circulated through Hollywood about his intimidating demeanor. Colleagues described him as disciplined to a fault and often emotionally unreachable. Some said he demanded total silence on set. Others hinted that getting close to Clint was almost impossible. Even in interviews, he kept his answers brief and carefully measured. Nothing was ever given away for free. Not his emotions, not his opinions, and certainly not his affections. And it was not just co-stars or reporters who noticed. Clint Eastwood had at least 8 known children with multiple women. Some of those children grew up largely in the dark, rarely seeing their father or even knowing about one another's existence. Others described a strange, strained relationship with the man behind the legend. He was a father, yes, but not always a present one. In some cases, he was little more than a name on paper. What is so unsettling is how the public image and the private man seem to blur. Clint played emotionally hardened characters because, some suspected, that was who he truly was. His roles were marked by isolation, vengeance, and stoicism. And as more stories began to surface from those who knew him personally, it became harder and harder to separate the actor from the act. But none of this prepared anyone for what his son Scott Eastwood would eventually admit. While fans saw Clint as a timeless symbol of masculinity, Scott saw something very different. A man who ruled with silence, who feared vulnerability, and who left emotional scars he never truly addressed. And yet, this is only the beginning. Clint Eastwood may have ruled Hollywood with quiet power, but his personal life was anything but orderly. Over the years, it became clear that Clint was not just a father. He was a father to many. Officially, Clint has 8 known children, but for decades, the exact number remained uncertain. Some children were not even acknowledged publicly until they were adults. Others were kept far apart, scattered across different households, mothers, and upbringings. It was a family tree drawn in shadows, with more questions than answers. One of Clint's earliest children, Kimber Eastwood, was reportedly kept secret for years. Her mother, Roxanne Tunis, had a long-standing affair with Clint while he was married to Maggie Johnson. Kimber did not meet her father until she was in grade school. Later, Allison and Kyle Eastwood came from Clint's marriage to Johnson. But even they described a household that felt more formal than warm. Allison once hinted in an interview that Clint's style of parenting was very strict and very private, a far cry from the idealized family man many assumed he was. Then came a string of relationships: Jocelyn Reeves, Francis Fisher, Dina Ruiz, each resulting in children who grew up under vastly different circumstances. Some of them barely knew about one another until adulthood. There was no traditional family home, no weekly dinners, no shared memories of birthdays or holidays. Instead, there were splintered relationships and a legacy of emotional distance that none of the Eastwood children could ignore. This was the environment Scott Eastwood was born into. His mother, Jocelyn Reeves, raised him and his sister mostly on her own in Hawaii. For much of his childhood, Clint Eastwood's presence was occasional, more like a shadow than apparent. There were no bedtime stories, no weekend fishing trips, and no real sense of family unity. Scott grew up hearing the name Clint Eastwood, not as a father figure, but as a Hollywood monolith, a man more myth than human. And yet, despite the distance, Scott still longed for connection. He watched his father dominate the screen, admired his talent, and quietly wondered what it would be like to truly know him. But Clint kept his worlds tightly sealed. Public fame, private silence. And for most of his children, that wall never came down. But one day, Scott decided he would no longer wait in the wings. Scott Eastwood may have inherited his father's chiseled looks and brooding presence, but the path he walked was nothing like Clint's. From a young age, Scott understood that he bore a famous name, but he quickly learned that the name came with walls, not shortcuts. Growing up in Hawaii with his mother, flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, Scott rarely saw Clint. There were no Hollywood privileges, no red carpet childhood. Instead, there was distance, physical, emotional, and unmistakably intentional. By the time Scott was a teenager, he realized just how different his experience was from the children of other celebrities. While some sons of movie stars were gracing magazines or getting early breaks in acting, Scott was working odd jobs, construction, parking cars, bussing tables. Not because he had to, but because Clint wanted it that way. According to Scott, his father made it clear, if you want to succeed, you do it on your own. No favors, no handouts, not even his last name. In fact, Clint Eastwood insisted that Scott audition under the name Scott Reeves, using his mother's surname. He was told to earn every opportunity like any unknown actor would. And Scott did just that. He faced rejections. He waited tables. He went to acting classes knowing full well that casting directors might have said yes if they knew who his father was. But he refused to play that card. Not because he was proud, but because he had no choice. The rejection stung even more because it came from the one person he desperately wanted approval from. Clint's silence, his emotional detachment, and his insistence on tough love created a quiet ache that Scott carried for years. In interviews, Scott has said that his father was never mean, but he was distant, a looming figure who set the bar high but rarely offered a hand to reach it. There were moments when Scott would catch a glimpse of warmth, an encouraging word, a brief smile, but they were fleeting. Most of the time, Clint remained closed off, seemingly more invested in discipline than affection. As Scott later admitted, he was old school. If you messed up, he told you straight. But there were no hugs, no big talks, just a nod or a look, and that was it. And yet, despite the cold exterior, Scott kept pushing. He worked harder, trained longer, auditioned more. He wanted to earn his place in the industry, not just to prove himself, but maybe, just maybe, to earn his father's respect. But what came next would be far more than career success. It would be a turning point in how Scott saw his father, and how the world would see Clint Eastwood. After years of grinding it out, Scott Eastwood finally began to catch his break. He landed small roles in independent films, working his way up without fanfare. But it was not until he appeared in The Longest Ride, a romantic drama based on the Nicholas Sparks novel, that Hollywood started to take serious notice. With rugged good looks and a commanding presence, many viewers could not help but make the connection. The resemblance to Clint was undeniable. The jawline, the eyes, the intensity. But even as his star rose, Scott remained guarded. Interviews were polite, but careful. He would talk about surfing, staying humble, working hard, but rarely about Clint. It was not until several years later, during a string of high-profile roles in films like Fury, Suicide Squad, and Pacific Rim, Uprising, that journalists started pressing harder. What was Clint like as a father? Did they have a close bond? Was there any tension? For a long time, Scott kept his answers vague. But in a 2021 interview, he finally let the curtain drop, just a little. He admitted that Clint was not the easiest dad, and that growing up with him as a father came with a lot of pressure, but not a lot of connection. In his words, a lot of us just wanted his time. That quiet sentence said more than any dramatic headline ever could. For years, fans had suspected that the stoic, unemotional man they saw on screen was not an act. And now, his own son was confirming it, not in anger, but in sadness. Scott confessed that, for most of his youth, Clint treated him more like a soldier than a son. Discipline, rules, and hard work were emphasized, but emotional availability? That was never on the table. Clint had built a world around control, around structure, and while it made him an icon, it also made him unreachable. The world had long admired Clint for his strength, his independence, his mysterious nature. But Scott's quiet confession painted a different picture. A man who had survived life by keeping people at a distance, including those who loved him most. Clint Eastwood never let his guard down. Not on set, not in interviews, and not at home. Still, Scott did not speak with resentment. He spoke with reflection. It was as if, by sharing the truth, he was trying to find peace with it, a way to understand the man who had shaped his life, but never truly shared it. And yet, the most powerful revelations were still to come. Not from the public stage, but from what Scott saw behind the scenes. A side of Clint Eastwood the world had never seen, until now. By the time Scott Eastwood entered his late 20s, he was no longer just Clint's son. He was a working actor with a voice of his own. And in that time, he began to see something most people never did. The man behind the myth. Scott started visiting his father more frequently, spending time on set and behind closed doors. What he discovered was not a monster, but a deeply complicated man. A man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. Clint Eastwood, the symbol of hard-edged American masculinity, was not just quiet. He was distant, even at home. Scott recalled dinners that felt more like board meetings. Birthdays that came and went with little more than a handshake. Holidays where presence was expected, but emotional connection was optional. There were no heart-to-hearts, no big talks about life, love, or pain. Just long silences, glances, the occasional approving nod. He operated like a director, even at home, Scott said in a later interview. He did not tell you what to do, but you knew what he expected. There was this invisible rule book we were all supposed to follow. It was not anger that Scott expressed. It was confusion, a sense of growing up around greatness, but always from a distance. And yet, what struck Scott the most was Clint's control over every part of his life. The man was relentless, from his physical health to his public image to how his children were presented to the world. Everything was curated, managed, and protected. Vulnerability was a weakness. Emotion was a risk. Even in private, Clint seemed to be performing a role, the unshakable patriarch, the cowboy who never cracked. But Scott began to see through the cracks. The missed calls, the way Clint would abruptly end conversations the moment they got personal, the way he changed the subject if a topic hit too close to home. There was a quiet tension underneath the surface, like Clint was guarding something he never wanted to face. And as Scott watched, listened, and learned, he began to understand something many fans had only guessed at. Clint Eastwood was not heartless. He was haunted. Haunted by choices, by regrets, by the things he never said, and the people he never truly let in. There were ghosts in Clint's silence, and Scott could feel every one of them. The truth was not that Clint Eastwood did not care. It was that he did not know how to show it. And Scott, like so many of Clint's children, spent years trying to interpret the silences, to find meaning in the quiet. But what came next finally answered the question fans had asked for decades. Was Clint's coldness just his way of surviving, or was it something deeper? Scott was ready to give his answer, and it would leave no doubt. In interviews, Scott Eastwood always seemed careful, measured, like someone who knew the cost of saying too much. But when asked what Clint was really like as a father, Scott finally gave a glimpse into the emotional heart of the story. And what he said confirmed something fans had quietly suspected for years. Clint Eastwood did not know how to be close, because he had spent his entire life running from closeness. Scott admitted it plainly. He taught me how to survive, but not how to feel. It was not a bitter confession. It was honest, even protective in its own way. But in those words, the full weight of Clint Eastwood's legacy came crashing down. Not in scandal, not in disgrace, but in sadness. For all the power, respect, and legendary status Clint earned over decades in Hollywood, the one thing he never mastered was intimacy. Scott explained that Clint was never cruel, but he was cold. He could be generous in practical ways, offering career advice, helping with business decisions, but when it came to emotion, he shut down. There were no stories from Clint's past, no insights into how he felt about fatherhood, and no conversations about what truly mattered beyond work. Scott said it always felt like his father was at war with his own emotions. That was the truth fans had tiptoed around for years. They admired Clint for being strong, for being stoic, but deep down, they sensed there was more, that the silence, the distance, the hard-edged persona, it was not just an act, it was a shield. Scott saw it up close. He watched his father sit quietly at family gatherings, never the center of attention, never speaking more than he had to. He watched Clint avoid eye contact when someone brought up the past. He watched him light up only when discussing work, movies, projects, goals. Everything else kept behind an emotional curtain. Scott's confession was not a takedown. It was a revelation. He wanted the world to understand the full picture, not just the cowboy with squint, but the man behind it, the one who built walls so high that even his children could barely reach him. And in doing so, Scott may have done something that Clint himself never could. He told the story honestly, not with judgment, but with compassion. He spoke the words Clint never did, and by doing so, he gave voice to the silence so many had noticed, but could never explain. In the end, Scott Eastwood's confession did not tarnish his father's legacy. It deepened it. By sharing his truth, Scott gave fans something they never truly had before. A real glimpse into Clint Eastwood, the man, not just the actor or the icon. And what he revealed was not scandal or drama, but something far more human. Something that echoed through families around the world. A father who meant well, but could never quite bridge the emotional gap. Clint Eastwood spent a lifetime commanding the screen, defining an era of masculinity that valued strength over sensitivity, silence over softness. But behind all that myth was a man who seemed deeply afraid of vulnerability. He conquered Hollywood, directed masterpieces, inspired millions, but struggled to sit across the table and connect with his own children. Scott's story resonates not because it is explosive, but because it is familiar. Many people have lived with fathers who provided but did not comfort, who disciplined but did not understand, who loved deeply, but only in their own tightly locked way. And Scott's honesty about that experience gave words to something millions have felt, but never quite said out loud. He never accused Clint of being a bad father. He simply showed the truth, that even legends are flawed, that success on the outside does not always translate to connection on the inside, and that sometimes the greatest struggle is not achieving greatness, but learning how to share it. As for Scott himself, his story is still unfolding, but one thing is clear. By breaking the silence his father never could, he may have taken the first real step in healing a legacy that was powerful, but painfully incomplete. He may never have gotten the emotional closeness he hoped for, but in speaking up, he reclaimed something else: understanding, perspective, and maybe even peace. Because in the end, Clint Eastwood did not have to be perfect. He just had to be known. And now, thanks to his son's courage, he finally is. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you or made you see Clint Eastwood in a new light, we would love to hear your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of Hollywood's biggest legends. And as always, stay curious, because sometimes the truth behind the camera is even more powerful than what we see on screen.